Millions of years ago, much of America's southeast coast was underwater. In the state of Georgia, the ocean's shores once followed a line from Augusta to Milledgeville, Macon, and Columbus. As the tectonic plates shifted and the ocean retreated, a series of barrier islands were formed, some of which are now sandy hills many miles inland. Today, the most recent line of barrier islands straddle the Georgia coastline, from Florida to South Carolina. The Atlantic's westernmost reach on the east coast touches a small Georgia barrier island named St. Simons. For thousands of years, native Indians moved freely about the region from village to village with the changing seasons. Their trade network with other Indian tribes extended from the northeast to the Mississippi. Tribes were comprised of a number of chiefdoms, each having many villages under its authority. A village might house 300 people, and each village chief, known as the cacique or miko, paid allegiance to the main chief, the miko mayor, to whom a tribute of pearls, shells, and other commodities might be paid. The dominant Indian tribe in the southeast was the Timucua, whose region included much of northern Florida and southeast Georgia, from St. Augustine to the Altamaha River at Sapelo Island. The Wally tribe occupied the barrier islands and coastal area from the Altamaha to Tybee Island near Savannah. The Mocama, who spoke a Timucua dialect, occupied the area from St. Simon's Island to the St. Johns River near Jacksonville. On St. Simon's, evidence of Indian habitation going back almost 5,000 years can be found on the northern sections at Hampton and Cannons Point and at Frederica, where shell middens, the remains of meals and other refuse, accumulated around each settlement. South of Frederica, Indians inhabited sections of present-day Oglethorpe Park, Gascoigne Bluff, the airport, and the village, among other locations. The Native Americans of the East Coast didn't live in teepees like their Western Plains counterparts. A typical village was surrounded by agricultural fields where corn, squash, and beans were grown. Crops were rotated to maintain soil fertility. Food was kept in small storehouses raised off the ground. Small structures for families built of wood and palm thatch circled a central plaza. A large council house where the chief held office and where tribal business was conducted would be located in the main village. Visitors to the village would be quartered in the council house. The natives used fire and other tools to hollow out tree trunks to make canoes. Local tribes and families would move around during the year to take advantage of seasons to gather fish and shellfish. Fires were lit in clay pits inside the boat to attract fish at night. Fish smoked on a rack over a fire could be stored and consumed much later. Villagers moved to hunting camps during the year, following deer herds. Excavations in 1936 at what is now the airport on St. Simons uncovered the remains of an Indian village. Smithsonian archaeologists found over 21,000 artifacts, including pottery, flint projectile points, conch shell earrings, and mussel shell pendants. Archaeologists unearthed the skeletons of Indians with funeral offerings that included turtle shells, bear teeth, and pendants. Molds were made of holes that once held support posts of a village structure, indicating the dimensions and possibly what the building was used for. Today, on St. Simons, you can still find places that resemble village landscapes from the days of Indian occupation. After thousands of years of living off the land, the Timucua, Wally, and Mocama's lives would soon change forever. What they didn't know was that explorers on ships from across the ocean were coming to their shores. By the early 1500s, Spanish explorers and settlers had arrived on the Georgia coast and would forever change the lives of the native inhabitants. Accompanying the settlers and military men were Jesuit priests and Franciscan friars who came to convert the Indians to the Christian faith. More than 100 years before California's missions were built and 40 years before the founding of Jamestown, Jesuit priests and later Franciscan friars were establishing missions in Florida and Georgia. A chain of missions was built from St. Augustine westward across the panhandle of Florida to the present-day Alabama border. Each mission was about 1 day's journey apart. Another chain of missions and settlements was established northward on the mainland and on the barrier islands as far as present-day South Carolina. These missions were also approximately 1 day's journey apart. Most missions were set in an existing Indian village. They were typically comprised of a walled compound that included a church or iglesia, a kitchen or cocina, and a convento where the friar or friars resided. Mission churches were often rectangular buildings about 60 feet long by 35 feet wide, with interior support posts. Their walls might be made of vertical boards or wattle and daub. Their thatched roofs were fashioned out of palm or palmetto fronds. Floors were usually packed earth or clay. Here, Mass was held, and Indian converts were buried. Because of the building materials used, none of the churches survived for long once they were abandoned. Gradually, the Indian tribes that had once dominated the Georgia coast found themselves subjugated to Spanish authority. A system of forced labor called repartimiento, meaning partition or distribution, caused the premature deaths of many natives who raised crops, carried produce to St. Augustine at the Gulf Coast, or helped build fortifications. This romanticized depiction of Indians laboring in the fields portrays them with European features. Tens of thousands of Indians died as a result of burden-bearing, malnourishment, and diseases transmitted by the Europeans. In 1597, Juanillo, the son of a Wally Indian chief, led a rebellion when a Spanish missionary interfered with his right to succession after his father's death. The Indians attacked missions along the coast. One missionary was slaughtered on his return trip from St. Augustine. When the revolt ended, 5 friars were dead. Another friar was captured by the Indians and sent to the interior as a slave. Over time, 2 missions and 4 Indian settlements would be established on St. Simon's Island, which the Spanish then called Isla de Guaraquini. After English-sponsored hostile Indians raided a mission at present-day Fort King George near Darien, that mission was relocated to the north end of St. Simon's at what is now Cannon's Point. The mission was named Santo Domingo de Asajo and was inhabited by Wally Indians. A few miles away, at what is now Fort Frederica, another village was established and named San Simon. This village was comprised of Yamasee Indians. San Simon was likely named in honor of Simon the Zealot, one of the 12 apostles. Though the settlement was not a mission, it might originally have been intended to be one. The name San Simon would later be anglicized by the English to St. Simon's. On the south end of the island, a few miles from San Simon, another Yamasee village, Ocotonico, was established. A second mission, San Buenaventura de Guadalquivir, was built near the present-day lighthouse on the southernmost part of the island. Missions were named for the saint on whose feast day Mass was first held, and often an Indian town or group was added to the place name. In this instance, San Buenaventura del Guadalquivir was named for Saint Bonaventure and was located on the island the Indians called Guadalquivir. In 1680, the village of San Simon was attacked by Indian raiders from the mainland, looking for enemy to sell as slaves to the English. In October of 1684, both San Buenaventura on the south end of St. Simon's and Asejo on the north end were sacked and burned to the ground by pirates. These same pirates had first attempted to raid St. Augustine, but were repulsed and turned their attention to the more vulnerable missions to the north. As a result of these and other raids, the Spanish missions on the Georgia coast were either abandoned or relocated further south to Florida, closer to the relative safety afforded by St. Augustine. By 1685, the Spanish presence extended no further north than present-day Amelia Island. Over time, the remaining mission Indians of St. Simon's were transported from Spanish-held Florida to Havana, Cuba, along with other indigenous people of the southeast. They settled in an area southeast of Havana called Guanabacoa. Today, Guanabacoa is a Havana neighborhood. It's possible that the descendants of Indians who once lived on St. Simon's and the Georgia coast still live there. Today on St. Simon's, arrowheads, pottery shards, and shell middens where Indian villages once lay are all that remain of the Timucua, Wally, Mocama, and Yamasee tribes that inhabited the island. By the late 1600s, the seeds of the transatlantic slave trade were taking root in the American colonies. A new colony named Georgia would be tempted to adopt slavery as a source of free labor. Years before Georgia's founding, a baronet named Robert Montgomery proposed settling 400 square miles of land between the Savannah and Altamaha rivers. The colony, to be named Azelia and composed of England's poorer classes, never got past the planning stages. But the threat of Spanish invasion from the south and French attack from the west increased with each passing year, and the need for a buffer colony between Charleston and the frontier lands was urgent. Back in England, one man, James Edward Oglethorpe, would emerge as the eventual founder of the new colony. James Oglethorpe was born in London and grew up near Godalming, a market town southwest of London. He received his education at Eton and Corpus Christi College at Oxford, but left school prematurely to pursue a military career, traveling to France, where he briefly attended a military academy. Within a year, he was learning the art of war firsthand under the brilliant military strategist Prince Eugene of Savoy, and engaged in battles against the Ottoman Turks. His military tutelage there would serve him well later in the Georgia colony against Spanish forces. The young veteran returned to England and in 1722 was elected to the House of Commons as a Tory, where he emerged as a staunch supporter of national defense, an advocate for free trade and patent rights, and a supporter of humanitarian efforts, including aid to the oppressed Protestants of Salzburg. In Oglethorpe's day, debtors could be imprisoned at the request of creditors. Conditions inside the prisons were often squalid, and corruption among jailers was rampant. When an old friend died in jail, Oglethorpe pressed for an investigation into debtors' prisons and served as chair of the jail's committee. He is shown seated on the far left in this painting. His inquiries into abuses by wardens and their deputies resulted in much-needed prison reform measures and made Oglethorpe a well-known figure in England. The release of debtors from the prisons added to the swell of Britain's unemployed poor. To help remedy this problem, James Oglethorpe and others petitioned the Crown to establish a colony between South Carolina and Spanish Florida. In 1732, a charter was granted, and the new colony would be named Georgia, in honor of its benefactor, King George II. Oglethorpe and other members of the Jails Committee would serve as the new colony's trustees. In November 1732, 114 skilled laborers and their families left Gravesend. None of them were former debtors. The settlers were hand-selected by the trustees in hopes that they would immediately contribute to the new colony's success. Oglethorpe accompanied the colonists on the frigate Anne for a 2-month journey across the Atlantic, where they stopped briefly in Charleston and Port Royal, South Carolina. They arrived at Yamacraw Bluff in February 1733 and began to establish the town of Savannah. South Carolina militia and slaves helped clear the forest, and the new town quickly took shape based on a distinct town plan designed by Oglethorpe. Oglethorpe immediately established a friendship with the Yamacraw chief Tamachichi. The chief's nephew, Tunahowie, would grow up to be a brave ally of the English. Oglethorpe, desiring to build a free, classless society, prohibited slavery in Georgia despite its appeal among other colonies. He set about establishing ring settlements around Savannah to grow crops and serve as lookouts for hostile French or Spanish forces. Over time, Oglethorpe built a series of forts along the coast from Darien to the St. Mary's River. Rangers on horseback and scouts in sailing boats kept a constant vigil for invading forces. One of the Georgia Charter's goals was to create commerce in the new colony. Oglethorpe established licensed traders who set up posts along well-established Indian trails. The deerskin trade was a lucrative business that helped sustain Georgia's infant economy. In 1734, Oglethorpe returned to England and a year later arrived with 200 more colonists to settle St. Simon's Island. The new settlers made the 5-day journey from Savannah to St. Simon's in longboats, traveling down the intracoastal waterway between the mainland and the barrier islands. Oglethorpe, a student of human nature, wisely stored the beer on the lead boat to discourage stragglers. The site chosen for the new town of Frederica was the former Yamasee Indian village of San Simon, described as 30 or 40 acres of cleared land about 10 feet above the high water mark and level for about a mile into the island. The new town, Frederica, was named in honor of Prince Frederick, King George II's oldest son, and at the time heir to the crown. Oglethorpe settled Frederica's citizens and soldiers at strategic sites around the island to farm the land and to prevent the Spaniards from landing. On the northeast tip of St. Simon's, a grant of land was given to Daniel Cannon, a master carpenter, along with his 2 sons. To this day, it is known as Cannon's Point. Across the creek from Cannon's Point was another settlement known at first as New Hampton and later as Hampton. Here, 19 soldiers and their families were each given 50 acres to farm. 2 Frederica settlers, John Lawrence and Archibald Sinclair, were granted tracts of land on the eastern shore of St. Simon's. Richard Pike, accompanied by his wife and daughter, was put in charge of a watch house on the western side of the island to look out for approaching vessels. Soldiers stationed there were rotated weekly. Below Pike's Bluff, several plantations were established at West Point. Directly across from Frederica was another settlement named German Village. This site was settled by Salzburgers, Lutheran refugees who fled their native state in modern-day Austria to escape religious persecution. These families raised crops, fished the local waters, and sold them to the townspeople and officers of Frederica. Sites on the south end of St. Simon's were also settled. Captain Raymond Demry named his home, located below German Village, Harrington Hall, in honor of Lord Harrington, who he served with at Gibraltar. John Terry, Frederica's recorder, who maintained public records, built a large house and laid out hundreds of orange trees at his plantation called Orange Grove, where he also ran a silversmith shop. Another captain of the regiment, George Dunbar, started a plantation on the bank of Dunbar Creek. Hawkins Island was granted to Frederica's town doctor, Thomas Hawkins, for use as his plantation. Captain James Gascoigne chose a bluff on the southeast side of the island as the headquarters for the vessels of Georgia's First Navy. Here he kept a supply storehouse and maintained a place to repair ships. He was also granted 500 acres for a plantation where he built a large home. On the south end of St. Simons, John Humble, the island's first harbor pilot, built his house on what is now Sea Island Golf Course land. Just east of the modern-day lighthouse, Oglethorpe established 2 forts where a small neighborhood of clapboard houses and streets were built to accommodate the regiment stationed there. The first structures at Frederica were tents and 40 by 20-foot lodges made of poles and palmetto thatching that provided temporary shelters. Oglethorpe laid out a town plan of about 40 acres that accommodated both soldiers and settlers. Large lots allowed for homes and gardens for each family. Broad Street, up to 25 yards wide, and other wide avenues made the rapid deployment of troops possible. 2 wards, north and south, were laid out in 84 lots. A large moat and a wall of posts 10 feet high formed the stockade that surrounded the town. Before long, substantial brick, tabby, and clapboard homes took shape. Frederica would be one of Britain's most expensive fortifications in North America. Today, you can still see a portion of the fort where ammunition was stored. The wide streets of the old town where troops once marched, and portions of the moat that once surrounded Frederica. In 1736, John Wesley and his brother Charles came to Georgia as young men fresh from Oxford University to minister to the colonists in Savannah and Frederica as well as their Indian allies. While their stay was at times contentious and short-lived, they would return to England, where they began the evangelical movement known as Methodism. Charles would go on to pen many well-known hymns, including "Hark the Herald Angels Sing." This marker at Christ Church is located near the spot where Charles Wesley delivered his first sermon upon arriving at Frederica in 1736. The first house on the south side of Broad Street belonged to Samuel Davison and Thomas Hawkins. This house, erected by Daniel Cannon and his sons, was a duplex divided by a common wall. The east side belonged to Samuel Davison, who made gun stocks and served as a town constable. He also ran a tavern in the basement. Davison lived here with his wife and 3 children, 2 of whom were born there. Thomas Hawkins, Frederica's doctor, apothecary, and magistrate, lived on the west side of the house with his wife Beatrice, a troublemaker who made life difficult for the Wesley brothers and others. As the wife of the town magistrate, she plied her mischief with impunity, once attacking John Wesley with scissors and a pistol. Thomas Hawkins, a man of violent temper and often embroiled in lawsuits, succeeded in causing Davison and others to leave Frederica. Today, you can still see the foundation of this 3-story brick home and the floor of Davison's Tavern. Hawkins Island, a marsh hammock located on the present-day Sea Island Causeway, belonged to Thomas Hawkins. Eventually, the trustees removed Hawkins from office, and he returned to England in 1743. The soldiers' barracks, located on the north side of Frederica, was a 90-foot square tabby structure with a shingle roof surrounding a courtyard. These barracks also served as a hospital and quarters for political prisoners. Today, only the sentry tower remains. Oglethorpe erected Fort St. Simons and De La Galle's Fort on the south end of St. Simons. Their purpose was to prevent the Spanish from landing on the island or entering the harbor. They were located east of the present-day lighthouse. As this vintage map shows, 70 or more clapboard houses, aligned in neat rows with regular streets, were constructed as barracks for the troops stationed there. Over the years, the southeast corner of St. Simons has eroded, and remains of the 2 forts and much of the former barracks location are now underwater. In 1758, colonial Georgia was divided into 13 parishes from Augusta to St. Mary's. St. Simon's Island became a part of St. James Parish. After 2 Scottish Highlanders stationed on Amelia Island were murdered and beheaded by Spaniards, Oglethorpe led a counterattack into Florida, where he captured 2 forts, Pupo and Picolata, on the St. Johns River. In May of 1740, Oglethorpe attacked St. Augustine, leading an invading force that included soldiers from South Carolina, Scottish Highlanders from Darien, and Indian warriors. The British invaders established themselves on Anastasia Island, across the Matanza River from Fort San Marcos. The British Navy blockaded the port in an effort to starve the inhabitants, while the ground forces set up batteries for the siege. For 27 days, Oglethorpe's artillery shelled the towns of St. Augustine and Fort San Marcos. With a cannon range of over 900 yards, the British bombardment proved to be ineffective against the soft coquina stone used to build the fort, which absorbed much of a cannonball's impact. Failing to take the fort, the British retreated back to Georgia and South Carolina on July 20th. 132 of Oglethorpe's men were killed during the siege, and another 34 were captured. In July 1742, Manuel de Montiano, General and Governor of Florida, led an armada of 52 ships carrying 3,000 men from Havana and St. Augustine to invade Georgia and the Carolinas. Although a storm broke up the fleet en route, 34 ships entered the St. Simon Sound on the 5th of July, 1742, with cannon blasting. The outcome of this invasion, as Thomas Carlyle later wrote, determined whether the New World would be Spanish or English. As this map of the battle depicts, the Spaniards were forced to run a gauntlet of British naval craft and shore batteries. They managed to make it past the curtain of fire with only 4 killed and 9 wounded. Once the ships passed safely, Oglethorpe abandoned both forts and retreated to Frederica. The passage through the Sound carried the Spanish ships past both forts on the southern end of the island. They made anchor at Gascoigne Bluff on the Frederica River in the late afternoon and disembarked by boat that night. The following morning, Spanish forces followed the beach on foot from the Frederica River and took possession of Fort St. Simon's. Back at Frederica, Oglethorpe had transported most of the women and children to the mainland and prepared for battle. He and less than 700 men awaited the onslaught of more than 2,000 Spaniards. Although Montiano had a superior force and larger fleet at his disposal, Oglethorpe's strategic location of Frederica gave him several advantages. A ship attacking by water would encounter several hard turns in the river near Frederica. After rounding the first bend, it would be under fire by cannon on a nearby bluff. Before making the second turn, the ship would come within range of big guns mounted at Fort Frederica. The next turn in the river would put a ship at prolonged risk of cannon bursts without being able to return fire. A vessel would have to turn sideways in shallow water to bring its guns to bear, further exposing it to cannon fire in the narrow river. This would give the batteries at Frederica ample opportunity to sink 1 or 2 ships and block the river from further traffic. Fort Frederica's guns commanded both south and west approaches by river, making naval attack unlikely. This left Montiano with the option of sending his troops through 6 miles of wetlands and dense woods to attack Frederica, knowing his men could be ambushed at any point along the way. On the morning of July 7th, Montiano sent 2 reconnaissance patrols totaling more than 100 men to scout the best approach to Frederica. They advanced along the military road to within half a mile of the town before being detected. The Spanish force reached Gully Hole Creek and were in sight of Frederica when Oglethorpe charged out on horseback, leading a group of Rangers, Indians, and Highlanders, fewer than 100 men. This reckless and unexpected headlong assault caught the Spaniards off guard. The ensuing hand-to-hand combat resulted in 12 Spanish killed, 12 wounded, and 10 captured. One of Oglethorpe's men, a Scot, died of heat exhaustion. Oglethorpe, leading the charge, captured 2 of the enemy. Tunahowie, Tamachichi's nephew, by now a young warrior, was wounded in the fight but managed to kill his assailant. Stunned by the defeat at Gully Hole Creek, Spanish scouting parties retreated back to Fort St. Simons, allowing Oglethorpe time to set up an ambush comprised of regimental soldiers, Indians, and Highlanders. The spot he chose was just a few miles from Fort St. Simons, a place that came to be known as Bloody Marsh. Oglethorpe left his men and returned to Frederica to bring up reinforcements. Meanwhile, Monciano sent another detachment to assist stragglers from the scouting parties. When they reached a point where the road crossed the marsh, the British opened fire. The Spanish returned fire, blanketing the field of battle with a thick cloud of smoke. In the noise and confusion of the moment, several platoons of British regulars fled on foot. One of their officers, Raymond Demery, chased after them. He and others returned to the battle scene after meeting Oglethorpe on the road. Back at the scene of the battle, the remaining British troops and Highlanders exchanged gunfire with the Spanish for over an hour. When the Spaniards' ammunition supplies ran out, they retreated. The battle was won with 7 Spanish grenadiers dead, 11 wounded, and none of Oglethorpe's killed. A few days later, after failing to advance on Frederica by river, Monciano's forces sailed back to St. Augustine. On the way, they destroyed homes and forts on Jekyll and Cumberland Island. The attack on St. Simons represented Spain's last attempt to repossess territory north of the Florida border. At a bend in Demery Road, you will find a small area set aside by the National Park Service, where you can stand on the ground where the Battle of Bloody Marsh was fought. For his defense of the colony, James Oglethorpe was promoted to brigadier general. In 1743, he made another unsuccessful attempt at capturing St. Augustine. He returned to England that same year to face allegations of misconduct and to seek reimbursement from Parliament for more than £60,000 he had spent on the colony. The following year, all allegations were discharged, and Parliament repaid him in full. Back in England, Oglethorpe married Elizabeth Wright, an heiress, and resided at her inherited estate in Essex. He served on the Board of Trustees of Georgia, resumed his seat in Parliament, and enjoyed the company of Britain's leading literary and artistic figures, including Samuel Johnson, author of the English Dictionary, Irish novelist Oliver Goldsmith, and biographer James Boswell. In 1745, Oglethorpe was promoted to the rank of Major General in the British Army and led a force to fight Jacobite forces from Scotland, determined to place Bonnie Prince Charlie on the British throne. After a skirmish in the north of England, bad weather allowed the enemy to slip away during the night. Oglethorpe was accused of not pursuing the invaders more aggressively, but was later acquitted of the charges. Oglethorpe served once more in Europe during the 7 Years' War. At the time, he assumed a fictitious name to avoid repercussions that might arise from a British general taking up arms against France. He returned to England, where he resumed a life of leisure and entertained friends. Oglethorpe lived long enough to see the American colonies, including Georgia, gain independence. In 1785, he met John Adams, America's first ambassador to Great Britain, and expressed great esteem and regard for the fledgling nation and his dismay over the ill will between the two countries. He died not long after that and was laid to rest beneath the chancel floor of All Saints Parish Church, adjacent to Cranham, his wife's estate. To this day, you can still find evidence of Oglethorpe's presence. On Anastasia Island in St. Augustine, where he once laid siege to the town, a boulevard is named in his honor. Part of Fort Frederica's magazine has been restored. Near Christchurch, a historical marker reminds visitors of Oglethorpe's headlong charge into Spanish forces at Gully Hole Creek. Just down the road, an engraved stone marks the spot where his two-story home once stood. On Demery Road, another stone tells the story of the Battle of Bloody Marsh. 2 towns, a county and a university, are named for Oglethorpe. In Savannah, a 9-foot bronze statue of Oglethorpe was erected in 1910 at Chippewa Square. The statue faces south so that he can keep a watchful eye on the Spanish. James Edward Oglethorpe gave all for the colony of Georgia and asked nothing in return. No salary, no property, not an acre of land. Perhaps more than any other colonial founding father, he embodied the Georgia trustees' adopted motto, not for self, but for others. During America's War of Independence, St. Simon's was mostly deserted. However, a brief naval battle, referred to as the Frederica Naval Action, took place on the Frederica River on the west side of St. Simon's Island. In April 1778, 4 British ships entered the Sound between Jekyll Island and St. Simon's. Word of their arrival reached Fort Howe on the Altamaha River, where Georgia Continental Army soldiers were stationed. Over 300 men marched from Fort Howe to Darien, where they immediately boarded 3 galleys and sailed for St. Simon's. The galleys were small, heavily armed vessels that could maneuver easily in shallow, winding rivers by oar or by sail. 3 British ships, the HMS Hinchinbrook, a 2-masted vessel, and 2 smaller ships, sailed up the Frederica River and put a scouting party ashore at Frederica. The Americans landed at Pike's Bluff on April 18th. 100 men raided Frederica and captured most of the British scouting party. The following morning, the American galleys attacked. At a sharp bend in the Frederica River called Raccoon Gut near Hawkins Island, the British ships ran aground. The enemy vessels were sitting ducks for the American galleys. The British abandoned their ships and rowed down river to the Sound and made good their escape on a 3-masted frigate, the Galatea. Though a minor victory in the overall war effort, the 3 captured enemy ships boosted morale for the American forces and ensured the enemy would no longer harass merchant vessels on the southern coast. In 1750, the Georgia trustees, against Oglethorpe's wishes, bowed to pressure from Georgia's colonists and made slavery legal. By the 1790s, the small colonial-era farms on St. Simon's were being supplanted by plantations that relied on slave labor. This new breed of planters raised rice crops that required extensive irrigation systems. They also began clearing land and planting long staple or sea island cotton, a variety with extra long fibers and silky texture, a much desired commodity that commanded high prices and only grew well in coastal areas. Both rice and cotton crops required extensive manual labor, which increased the demand for more slaves. By the early 1800s, 14 plantations dotted the island from the north end to the south. Most of the planters who owned these estates were educated men from Scotland, England, and New England. This closely knit group enjoyed frequent social interactions with one another, and in some instances intermarried. As this old silk map shows, the plantations were connected by a network of dirt and shell roads, some of which have been paved over and are used by islanders today. Cannon's Point, one of the island's most prosperous plantations, occupied the northeast tip of the island. The plantation was owned by John Cooper, a man known for his humor, his hospitality, and for his progressive approaches to agriculture. Cooper was born in the village of Lochwinnock, Scotland, about 12 miles southwest of Glasgow. His father was educated at Glasgow University and served as the minister of St. John's Church, also known as Old Simon. The bell tower and facade of the old church still stand. Cooper's older brothers were well educated, like their father. One became a minister and the other a surgeon. Both held professorships at Glasgow University. John Cooper came to America in 1775 as an indentured servant, as he put it, for the good of Scotland. He spent the War of Independence in British-held St. Augustine, working as a clerk in the dry goods firm Buchanan and Morrison. After the war, he settled first in Sunbury, north of Darien, before purchasing land at Cannon's Point in 1793. This is where the Spanish mission and Indian village Asajo was once located. The land was later granted to Daniel Cannon and his family under Oglethorpe. In 1796, Cooper and his wife Rebecca settled into the modest home originally built by Daniel Cannon. Today, the one-lane dirt road to Cannon's Point probably looks much the same as it did in the 1800s. This road led to a two-story structure built by Cooper in 1804, overlooking the Hampton River. A 10-foot-wide veranda wrapped around the three sides of the first floor, where occupants could sit and enjoy ocean breezes and view Long Island, now known as Sea Island, to the east. Looking across the marsh, they could see Little St. Simon's, on the right in this picture, and Sapelo Island, directly to the north. Cooper's spacious home sat on a tabby foundation made of lime, crushed oyster shells, sand, and water. He had a wine cellar built inside the foundation. An ice house was built nearby, along with this detached kitchen where the renowned chef Sanfoy, a free man, and his mentor, Cupidon, prepared lavish feasts for the many guests who graced Cooper's table. At these ovens, they often prepared meals for 20 people at a time. Inside the first floor of Cooper's home were the dining rooms, a parlor, and a library. Bedrooms and dressing rooms occupied the second floor, and a loft provided views in all directions on the top floor. Guests often stayed for weeks or months at a time. One young couple stopping at Cannon's Point on their honeymoon remained until their second child was born. This painting was done by Cooper's grandson, John Lord Cooper, shortly before he was killed during the Civil War in 1862. In 1794, the United States government sent crews to the coast to harvest live oak for the construction of naval vessels. John Cooper was clearing trees from his land to plant cotton and donated a magnificent oak tree that stood in his garden. The tree would become the stern post of the USS Constitution, better known as Old Ironsides. Though the Constitution has undergone numerous repairs since its launch in 1797, oak from Cannon's Point is still part of the ship's keel to this day. In time, Cooper became a prosperous cotton planter known far and wide for his scientific approach to agriculture. Cooper corresponded widely with other planters, including President Thomas Jefferson, who advised him to experiment with olive trees. Cooper imported 200 trees from Provence, which produced up to 300 bottles of olive oil per year. He also experimented with the production of silk and wine. Cooper's horticultural pursuits extended to planting date palms from Persia, plums, peaches, nectarines, and figs, among other exotic fruits. Cooper's son, James Hamilton, graduated from Yale. He, too, was a progressive planter and a Renaissance man who implemented steam-driven threshing machines and a rail system for moving produce on his rice plantation. James Hamilton Cooper married Carolyn Wiley, who lived at The Village, a nearby plantation. Among his many accomplishments, he was the architect of Christ Church, a Greek revival building on Johnson Square in Savannah, seen here as it looked in 1936. The church sits on land set aside by James Oglethorpe for the Georgia colony's first church. Another well-known estate was at Butler Point on the northwest end of St. Simons. This plantation just across Jones Creek from Cannons Point was once the site of an Indian village and later the location of Hampton, settled by British soldiers under Oglethorpe. Major Pierce Butler, son of an Irish baronet, came to the colonies as an officer in the British Army. He married Mary Middleton, a wealthy planter's daughter from the Charleston area. Butler sold his Army commission to fight with the American Patriots during the Revolutionary War. He purchased Butler Island near Darien, where he developed a vast network of rice fields. He also purchased land at Hampton on St. Simons, where he grew cotton. Though plantations and slave labor made him a wealthy man, and he managed his Georgia holdings as an absentee master from Philadelphia, where he purchased 2 homes. In 1804, Vice President Aaron Burr and former Secretary of the Treasury and Revolutionary War hero Alexander Hamilton met in a duel after Burr accused Hamilton of defamation. The duel took place on the west bank of the Hudson in New Jersey, the same location where Hamilton's son died in a duel 3 years earlier. Hamilton intentionally missed Burr with his shot, but Burr's bullet found Hamilton, who died the next day. Burr, accused of murder, fled to the south until the furor over Hamilton's death died down and wound up spending a month at Butler's Hampton plantation. Major Butler, considered an enigma by some contemporaries, willed the Georgia estate to his grandsons, bypassing his own children, provided that the grandsons changed their last name to Butler. Both John and Butler Meese did so. Butler Meese changed his name to Pierce Meese Butler. In 1834, Pierce Meese Butler married one of Britain's most admired actresses, Frances Anne Kemble, better known as Fanny Kemble. Kemble was an intellectual, an independent spirit, and an accomplished writer and musician. To win her hand, Butler followed her acting tour of the States, even offering to perform in the orchestra pit to be nearer the stage she performed on. The Butlers resided in this large brick home in Philadelphia, where Fanny gave up the stage and pursued a literary career. In 1835, she published Journal of Frances Anne Butler, a somewhat scandalous memoir about her experiences in America. This book foreshadowed another memoir she would publish during the Civil War. Pierce Butler thought marriage would transform Fanny into a dutiful wife. Likewise, Fanny thought she could change Butler's views on slavery. Both were in for a rude awakening. In 1836, Pierce Butler and his brother John assumed ownership of their grandfather's Georgia holdings. In addition to Hampton on St. Simons, the estate included a plantation on Butler Island, surrounded by tributaries of the Altamaha River. By inheriting the Butler estate, Pierce Meese Butler immediately became one of the wealthiest men in America and one of the largest slaveholders. The ditches surrounding each rice field were part of a dike system designed by engineers from Holland. The outlines of these rice fields can still be seen from the air. Butler Island was only accessible by water. Like his grandfather, Pierce Butler ran it with a tight fist, forbidding Butler slaves to mingle with other slaves in the area. Living on Butler Island assured that they were virtually isolated from Darien and surrounding plantations. The house in this photograph was built in 1927 at the site of the original plantation home. In front is the remains of a steam-powered rice mill chimney built in 1850 and operated by Butler slaves. In 1838, Pierce, Fanny, and their daughters Sally and Fanny came to Georgia to live on the plantations, which spanned over 1,000 acres, from Butler Island near present-day Interstate 95 to Butler Point on St. Simons. Travel from Butler Island to Hampton was by boat and could take several hours of rowing by slaves in good weather. The journey took travelers from the open sound to narrower alligator-infested rivers. Slave oarsmen often sang to maintain a rhythm as they rowed, and each plantation could be identified by their songs. The last leg of the journey opened onto the wide Hampton River. Butler Point, or Hampton, would be the first land they would encounter. In the distance, they would see Cannon's Point. For sport, the local planters raced rowboats manned by hand-picked crews. Huge wagers were placed on the competing boats that often finished the half-mile course in 2 minutes 20 seconds. One of the Butler oarsmen, Liverpool Hazard, lived to be 110 years old. He recalled the master having slaves train weeks in advance of these races. Not far from Butler Point on St. Simons, near where Hampton River empties into the Frederica River, a small piece of land named 5 Pound was set aside as a holding pen for the plantation's most violent and incorrigible slaves. From the air, you can still see the outline of this prison camp. Viewed from the river, one still gets a sense of the remoteness of this place, surrounded by marsh, rivers, and alligator nests. Slaves sent here were truly isolated from the rest of the world. Though Fanny enjoyed the company of most planters, John Cooper in particular, she abhorred slavery and the stories the slaves told her. During her visit, she wrote her observations in a diary which one day would be published as a new memoir that would rock the Southern establishment. The War of 1812 brought another invasion to the island. In January 1815, Admiral George Cockburn and the British Navy landed on St. Simons. The British ransacked the plantations, taking farming equipment and household items. They left with 138 Butler slaves, 60 slaves belonging to John Cooper, and another 238 owned by James Hamilton. Cooper and other planters sailed to Bermuda to seek the return of their slaves, and were astonished to learn they desired freedom rather than return to slavery. Many of the slaves settled in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Eventually, the planters were reimbursed for their losses by Great Britain. In 1850, one of the island's patriarchs, John Cooper, died at the age of 91, having left Scotland at the age of 16, never to return. His home at Cannon's Point, once the hub of social activity on the coast for many years, is now just a memory. The only evidence of this once prosperous plantation is the Tabby Foundation and the detached kitchen where Sang Froid and Cupidon once prepared sumptuous meals. Scattered about the property are pieces of the past, each with its own story to tell to the discerning eye. The Hampton River, which once flowed just feet from Cannon's Point, is now separated from the island by a large swath of marsh grass. This stump is all that remains of a palm tree Cooper may have planted himself. Like silent sentries, a sago palm and other exotic flora guard the entrance to Cooper's estate, reminders that a Scottish planter once ruled this end of the island. This ornate marker in Christchurch Cemetery marks the spot of Cooper's final resting place in his adopted land. The French Huguenot Raymond Demray, who served under James Oglethorpe, remained on St. Simons after the British left the island, purchasing large tracts of land on the coast. He built a 2-story mansion between Frederica and German Village, not far from the Battle of Gully Hole Creek, where Oglethorpe first skirmished with Spanish and Indian invaders. Demray renamed it Harrington Hall after William Stanhope, Lord Harrington, with whom he once served in Spain. Harrington Hall was located just north of the roundabout where Frederica and Lawrence roads merge. His plantation was roughly confined to the land between North and South Harrington roads, south of Harrington Hall. Raymond Demray died in 1766 and may have been buried at the Frederica Cemetery. Black Banks was the home of James Gould, originally from Granville, Massachusetts. This plantation, located in the middle of the island, was named for the Black Banks River that abutted it, and the rich, dark alluvial soil found on the river's banks. Like many coastal homes, Black Banks living quarters were raised off the ground in the event of flooding caused by hurricanes. James Gould probably arrived in Florida in 1794 to harvest timber for northern shipyards. He and his family narrowly escaped an Indian attack in which their home on the St. Mary's River was burned to the ground. In 1807, he applied for and won a government contract to build a lighthouse on the south end of St. Simons. The lighthouse was to be built on a 4-acre plot owned by John Cooper, who sold the land to the government for $1 in hopes that it would bring more shipping and commerce to the area. The 85-foot octagonal structure was built using slave labor with brick and tabby from the homes, walls, and fortifications of Frederica. After it was completed in 1810, President James Madison appointed Gould the keeper, a position he and several of his slaves fulfilled for the next 27 years. Gould died in 1852 and was buried not far from John Cooper's grave. South of Black Banks lay the plantation named Kelvin Grove. This estate occupied much of the island's southeast corner east of Frederica Road, from present-day Oglethorpe Park to the airport, and from near the St. Simon's Elementary School to the tip of East Beach. The first tract was purchased in the late 1700s by Thomas Cater, who came to St. Simon's with his young and beautiful wife, Elizabeth. Elizabeth Cater fell in love with their handsome overseer, and the two plotted to kill Thomas. The night of the murder, a loyal servant named Denbrough escaped with Cater's son Benjamin to Retreat Plantation, while Cater's wife and the overseer fled the island. Major Page of Retreat raised Benjamin as one of his own and provided for his education. Elizabeth Cater and her lover were never heard from again. According to family tradition, Denbrough, the faithful servant, buried Thomas Cater just north of the main house. Benjamin Cater attended Yale and afterward returned to the island to assume his role as master of Kelvin Grove. He married Margaret Armstrong, whose family at German Village was credited with bringing a sago palm to the island. Their daughter, Ann Cater, married James Postell of Savannah. Together they raised 10 children at Kelvin Grove. James Postell proved to be a successful cotton grower. Since his land included much of the beach area on St. Simon's, he was also an avid seashell collector, and his collections were eventually donated to museums. Their son, Clifford Postell, and his family are shown in this 1912 photograph on their way to church. Their descendants still live on the island. This image shows the approximate location in red of the Kelvin Grove home on Cater Street. The drive to Kelvin Grove's plantation house was once lined with sago palms. The 2 sago palms shown here on Cater Street were among the plants lining that driveway. Retreat, the southernmost plantation on the island, occupied land where John Humble, Oglethorpe's harbor pilot, once lived. Major William Page from Page's Point, South Carolina, purchased Retreat in the early 1800s after visiting his friend, Major Butler, on St. Simon's. He and his wife settled in a house built by the previous owner, Thomas Spaulding, a replica of Oglethorpe's home near Frederica. This English-style cottage by the ocean was built to withstand gales that occasionally swept the coast. Page's wife, Hannah, planted large areas of blooming shrubs, flowers, and vines. Sailors approaching the St. Simons Sound could smell the fragrant plants grown in the Retreat gardens before sighting land. Naturalist James Audubon, who once visited Retreat, recalled it as one of those fairy lands said to have existed in the Golden Age. Page's daughter, Anna Matilda, a much-admired Southern belle, learned from her parents the art of managing a large estate, a skill that would prove useful after she married. On a trip to the South in 1823, Thomas Butler King, a lawyer from Massachusetts, fell in love with and married Anna Page. 2 years after their marriage, Anna inherited Retreat. King was elected to Congress, where he served as chairman of the Committee on Naval Affairs and is credited for modernizing the Navy. Some of the ideas he initiated are in use today. In 1849, King went to California at President Taylor's request to investigate admitting the territory to the Union. The following year, President Fillmore made King collector of the port of San Francisco. In his absence, Anna skillfully managed the plantation just as her parents had taught her. The far-sighted King also envisioned building a transcontinental railroad across America decades before it was completed. At Retreat, Anna and Thomas King raised 6 children: Georgia Page, Florence, Henry Lord, Kyler, John Floyd, and Mallory. The avenue of live oaks leading to Retreat was part of a carriage road built by slaves in 1848. Both sides of the avenue were planted with 500 live oaks and extended north for over 1.5 miles. Today, a small strip of trees remains intact. In 1836, America's foremost civil engineer, Lyome Baldwin, came to Glynn County to survey the Brunswick Canal. While he was there, Thomas Butler King hired him to survey a drainage ditch for his cotton fields at Retreat. The Baldwin ditch, dug by slave labor, bisects the north end of the Avenue of Oaks. The sprawling house at Retreat, shown here in the late 1800s, survived the Civil War and a century of storms. Today, the ruins of a small portion of the home are all that remain of Retreat. The Plantation Slave Hospital, a 2-story tabby structure, had rooms for women on the first floor, men on the second, and living quarters for 2 nurses in the attic. Measures have been taken to preserve the hospital ruins for posterity. Major William Page died in 1827 at the age of 63. He and his wife Hannah are buried at Christ Church Cemetery. Nearby are the final resting places of Anna Matilda Page King, who passed away in 1859, and her husband, Thomas Butler King, who died in 1864. Today, Retreat Plantation is home to the Sea Island Golf Club Resort. Just northwest of Retreat lies Hamilton, the plantation owned by James Hamilton, who came to America from Scotland in 1775 with John Cooper. The 2 friends and business partners settled on St. Simons at about the same time. Hamilton purchased land at Gascoigne Bluff, the port for Georgia's First Navy, and where the Spanish landed in 1742. From the Deepwater Wharf at Hamilton Plantation, goods were imported to the island, and St. Simons cotton and timber were exported to the world. James Hamilton's plantation became a major producer of long staple cotton, making him a wealthy man. Like Major Butler, he eventually moved to Philadelphia and sold the plantation to his namesake, James Hamilton Cooper, John Cooper's son. Slave cabins at Hamilton were built of tabby. A central fireplace divided each cabin, which housed 2 families. The cabins were restored by the local Casina Garden Club and are now on property included in the National Register of Historic Places. After the War of 1812, Frederica was mostly abandoned, used only to send and receive mail, and a place for locals to gather for 4th of July celebrations, boat races, and picnics. By 1820, a one-legged seafarer named James Freedmen acquired property at Frederica. He used it as a base for shipping produce and goods up and down the Georgia coast. Eventually, he would purchase much of the land at Frederica, where he also kept a tavern and store. Frewen was born near London in 1780 and served in the British Navy for 18 years, where it is likely he lost his leg. During the War of 1812, Frewen's ship, the Seahorse, participated in the attack on Washington, D.C. Men from his ship, possibly Frewen himself, occupied the town of Alexandria, Virginia. The Seahorse was also part of the British fleet supporting their attack on New Orleans. Captain Charles Stevens came to America from Denmark in 1836. Like Frewen, he shipped produce and freight along the Georgia coast by sailboat. He is shown here, about in 1860, with his daughter Mary. Stevens made Frederica the headquarters of his shipping business. Here he met and married the Frewen's niece, Sarah Dorothy Hay. Together they raised 7 children at Frederica. Over time, Charles Stevens acquired most of the property at Frederica. The Stevens home there stood for many years before the fort and Old Town became a national park. Hurricanes are a fact of life for people living on the Georgia coast. The native Indians who lived there established villages on the leeward side of the islands or in areas protected by live oak forests. For cotton planters, waterlogged fields meant the destruction of crops. During the 1800s, St. Simons experienced particularly destructive storms in 1804, 1824, and 1898. Storms also wreaked havoc on shipping, often hitting with little warning in the days before radar and satellites. This image of downtown Brunswick in 1898 attests to the flooding damage that can be inflicted on low-lying coastal areas. In 1803, enslaved Igbo tribesmen from modern-day Nigeria were shipped by boat to St. Simons. Though accounts of what transpired differ, it is known that a number of the men rebelled and drowned themselves rather than submit to slavery. The traditional location of their revolt is Dunbar Creek, which straddles the island between Hawkins Island and the Glen Haven neighborhood. The location became known as Igbo Landing. The landing is visible from the Sea Island Causeway Bridge. Local African Americans refused to fish at Igbo Landing out of respect for what happened there 200 years earlier. Raymond Demery's son and grandsons developed Mulberry Grove Plantation, whose footprint is roughly the outline of today's airport on St. Simons. In 1824, a young ward named Mary from Charleston was living at Mulberry Grove. One day, the Demery father and son quarreled. It's possible both were in love with her. The son left for Darien just as a hurricane approached the Georgia coast. The younger Demery attempted to return that evening. In the storm that covered the island in 6 feet of water, he and 5 black oarsmen drowned in Buttermilk Sound. Distraught over these events, Mary walked from Mulberry Grove to the St. Simon Sound, where she drowned herself. Over the years, a number of island residents claimed to have seen Mary's ghost wandering the south end of the island. Since then, she has been known as Mary the Wanderer. Another tragedy befell island residents in 1838. This incident involved a boundary dispute between the Wileys at German Village and the Hazards of Pike's Bluff and West Point. Dr. Thomas Hazard challenged John Armstrong Wiley to a duel, but Wiley refused. Later, they met by chance at the original Oglethorpe House Hotel in Brunswick. This time, young Wiley accosted Dr. Hazard twice. The second time, Hazard shot him through the heart. John Wiley's grave marker at Christ Church Cemetery is a broken shaft, emblematic of a life that ended too soon. Some speculate that the Hazards were ostracized from Christ Church by other island plantation families and built a small chapel at West Point where they could worship in private. However, the Hazards were later fully reinstated at Christ Church. Over time, their tiny sanctuary was covered in pink lichen, and became known as the Pink Chapel. The empty hazard burial plot, a tabby enclosure, still stands on the east side of Christ Church. By 1857, Pierce Butler had run up enormous gambling bills and lost money on bad investments. His mansion in Philadelphia and other properties were sold, but it wasn't enough to satisfy the debts. To help pay off his creditors, half the slaves, over 400, on his Georgia plantations were sold at a 2-day rain-soaked auction in Savannah. At first, the owner was to remain anonymous, but word soon got out that the slaves belonged to Butler, and the news made headlines. After the auction, the largest sale of slaves in this country's history, Butler took a trip to southern Europe. The sale of Butler's slaves, which became known as the Weeping Time, foreshadowed the end of an era and the ruinous days to come for all of the island's plantations. At the outbreak of America's Civil War, Joseph E. Brown, a fervent secessionist, was governor of Georgia. In April 1861, President Abraham Lincoln ordered a blockade of the Confederacy coastline, including Georgia's barrier islands. Governor Brown rushed 2,000 men to the Brunswick area, 1,500 of whom were stationed on St. Simon's. Fort Brown, named after the governor, was built between Retreat Plantation and the lighthouse to guard the approach to Brunswick Harbor. Earthworks and batteries like these were hastily erected with the help of slaves from Retreat Plantation. In October of 1861, Union naval vessels entered the St. Simon Sound under the direction of Admiral Samuel Francis DuPont, fleet commander of the blockade. By March of 1862, the North officially took possession of the island. Frigates like the steam-powered USS Paul Jones of the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron kept vigilance in the Sound between St. Simons and Jekyll during the war. The lighthouse James Gould built was destroyed by the Confederates to prevent the Union from using it as a beacon for their fleet. The Confederate soldiers left the island quickly. Many of the island's planters and their sons enlisted in the Confederate Army, and their families took refuge on the mainland, while most of the slave population remained on the island. In August 1862, a Negro regiment landed on St. Simon's to find 25 island slaves already armed and under the command of a fellow slave calling himself John Brown, who was later killed in a skirmish with the planters. In June of 1863, Robert Gould Shaw, colonel of the 54th Massachusetts All-Black Infantry Regiment, landed on St. Simon's, a place he described as beautiful and enchanting in letters to his wife Annie. The senior officer at St. Simon's was Colonel James Montgomery, a zealous abolitionist prone to using extreme tactics against civilian populations. Under his orders and against Gould's wishes, the undefended town of Darien, including the First African Baptist Church, was sacked and burned. Whether under Montgomery's orders or not, Christ Church at Frederica, constructed in 1820, was desecrated by the Union troops who burned its pews, shot out church windows, and demolished the altar. With the island's white families evacuated, the vandalized church remained open to the elements and quickly fell into disrepair. After leaving St. Simon's, the 54 Massachusetts under Shaw would distinguish themselves in the assault on Fort Wagner in Charleston. Colonel Shaw was shot through the chest 3 times, leading his men over a parapet during the battle. His letters to his family would later exonerate him in the burning of Darien. After divorcing Pierce Butler, Fanny Kemble held onto the diary of her 1838 stay at the Butler plantations. She resisted abolitionists' requests to publish her accounts until her 2 daughters in Butler's custody came of age. In 1863, Kemble published her second memoir, Journal of a Residence on a Georgian Plantation, in 1838 to 1839. The effect of her book was immediate and far-reaching. Portraits of the life the slaves endured resonated with the English audiences at a time when the South sought Britain's economic support for their war effort. It is said that Kemble's diary rivaled Uncle Tom's Cabin in turning public sentiment against the Southern cause. Captain Stevens, originally sympathetic with the Union cause, was mustered into the local Confederate militia. James Freedmen, the former British Navy seaman, remained at Frederica. To communicate with Stevens and others on the mainland, Freedmen would light a fire at Frederica during the night when no Union troops were present. From Bell Point, 3.5 miles across the marsh on the mainland, Stevens could see the fire and would come to visit Freedmen. On December 22, 1864, Stevens was taken prisoner while on patrol near the Altamaha River. 3 weeks later, Stevens was incarcerated at the Union's Fort Delaware in New Jersey, an unhealthy prison notorious for the high incidence of prisoner deaths. A few weeks after arriving at this facility, Stevens died of exposure to the cold and was buried at nearby Finns Point, New Jersey. A grave marker honoring Captain Stevens was placed in the Freedmen and Stevens plot at Christ Church, Frederica. James Freedmen also died at Frederica during the Union occupation, probably from the infirmities of old age. Charles Stevens' son John was with Freedmen at the time and went to the south end of the island to inform a Union officer who sent a detachment to Frederica to bury the former British sailor. In December of 1862, Confederate forces under Robert E. Lee engaged in bitter fighting with Union troops, led by Ambrose Burnside at Fredericksburg, Virginia. Fredericksburg, as it happens, was named after the same Frederick, Prince of Wales, for whom Frederica on St. Simon's was named. Lee's men held the high ground of Marie's Heights overlooking Fredericksburg. Henry Lord King of Retreat Plantation was killed in this battle after volunteering to carry dispatches to Brigadier General Thomas Cobb. He was killed by enemy fire upon returning from his mission. His body was retrieved from the field of battle that night. Thousands of men were buried at Fredericksburg, but Lord King's body was taken back to Georgia for burial in his family plot. Years later, 4 prominent citizens, Jacob Dart, Charles Spalding Wiley, M.J. Colson, and John Floyd King, posed for a photo to hear the tale of how Lord King's body was retrieved and brought home. The man telling the story was Neptune Small, Lord King's servant who accompanied him to Fredericksburg. Small crawled across the body-strewn battlefield at night and found his young master's lifeless body riddled with bullet wounds. The faithful servant brought King's body to Savannah, where it was temporarily interred until after the war, when it was safe to bring the body to St. Simon's for permanent burial. Lord King's grave at Christ Church Cemetery can be found in the King burial plot near the graves of his parents. Neptune also accompanied one of the other King sons, Cuyler King, during the Battle of Atlanta. Tradition holds that for his services to the King family, land overlooking the ocean near the lighthouse was named Neptune Park in his honor. Today, at Retreat Plantation, a sign marks the site of the slave burial ground. Nearby, a tabby marker where Neptune is buried recounts his heroic deeds. In 1863, the Ethan Allen, part of the Union's naval blockading squadron, sent men ashore for provisions. While rummaging at Retreat Plantation, the sailors took away souvenirs. One of the sailors took a mantel clock belonging to the King family. Time for slavery and the plantation system on St. Simon's had indeed come to an end. After the war, America experienced a building boom. Soon, Georgia pine was in demand in the North and across the ocean in Europe. Timber harvested and rafted downriver to sawmills for export boosted Georgia's economy. Pine trees cut down in middle Georgia were lashed together to form large rafts steered by raftsmen skilled at negotiating the river's currents and bends. A consortium of businessmen led by William Dodge of New York, for whom Dodge County, Georgia is named, acquired more than 300,000 acres of timberland in the central part of the state. The log rafts were floated down the Altamaha River to Darien and loaded onto barges for transport to St. Simons. The journey from Lumber City to the coast could take 12 days, depending on the current. Once there, the raft handlers headed back upstream on foot. On St. Simons, 4 large sawmills sprang up along Gascoigne Bluff, formerly the plantation owned by James Hamilton. The first mill, built by Urbanus Dart in 1874, occupied the southern end of the bluff. Hamilton Plantation's name was changed to the St. Simons Mills, or simply the Mills. Soon, the largely deserted plantation was a village with a population of 300 and its own post office. These lumber mills cranked out more than 40 million board feet of lumber each year, including timber used to build the Brooklyn Bridge. William Dodge's brother, Norman, co-owned the Dodge Meggs Company, which later became the Hilton Dodge Lumber Company. A third brother, Anson Dodge, was its superintendent. More than 1,000 ships anchored at the mills each year to load Georgia pine. The mills enjoyed modern conveniences of the day. Sawdust was burned to generate electrical power. Electric lights and the telegraph were in use by 1884. A deep well fed storage tanks that supplied fresh water to the mill operations, docked vessels, and even residences, while elevated rails carried lumber around the complex. Local islanders, many of them former slaves, worked at the mills as sawyers, stevedores, and carpenters. Their former masters took work as supervisors and bookkeepers. On good days, the mill saws ran until midnight. The former plantation buildings were converted for use by the mill's laborers and managers. This old Hamilton cotton barn was used as a general store. Another store was erected near the mills on Demery Road by 2 Brunswick businessmen, Robert and Sig Levison. The mostly black neighborhood near the store became known as Jewtown, a name that endures. With Christchurch, Frederica still in ruins following the Civil War, St. James Union Church, built in 1880, served the religious needs of various denominations. Nearby, the Mallon School was open to provide instruction for young students. Sailing vessels came to St. Simons from New England, Europe, and South America, some taking up to 6 days to fill their holds. Stone ballast from these ships was often dumped at the river's edge, forming small hammocks referred by locals as Little Europe. Anson Dodge's home was named Rose Cottage after the large rose garden that surrounded it. A number of these homes dotted the bluff. A ship at anchor waiting its turn to take on lumber for distant ports was a common sight for mill residents. Each day a ferry from Brunswick came to the mills with supplies, passengers, and mail. Larger passenger boats traveling between Savannah, Fernandina, and Jacksonville also made daily stops here. The mills operated until the early 1900s. By the 1930s, little evidence of their existence remained. In 1949, the United Methodist Church bought the upper portion of Gascoigne Bluff and built a retreat named Epworth in honor of Epworth, England, home to Methodism founders John and Charles Wesley. St. James Union Church was largely abandoned after the mills closed. This church was renamed Lovely Lane Chapel. The chapel is used for worship, weddings, and other special occasions. The big mill, once the locus of industry on the island, is no more. Today, hotel rooms built to accommodate Epworth visitors sit on land once occupied by the mill. If you look closely, you'll see the petrified remains of lumber produced here along the banks of the upper portion of the bluff. The passenger boat dock is long gone, and a modern marina has taken its place. Anson Dodge, Jr., the son of Dodge Meg's first superintendent and grandson of the wealthy philanthropist William Dodge, chose a different career path than his father and grandfather. Instead of commerce, he chose the clergy and enrolled at General Theology Seminary in New York. On his first visit to the island, he came across the abandoned Christ Church. Dismayed at its state of disrepair, he resolved to restore both the church and the cemetery. In 1879, at the age of 22, Anson Dodge quit the seminary and eloped with his first cousin, the beautiful Ellen Phelps Dodge. While on a world tour together, Ellen died of cholera in India. Dodge had her body embalmed and shipped back to St. Simon's in a metal casket. Grief-stricken, Dodge completed his seminary studies and was ordained in 1884. That June, he served as the pastor at St. Mark's Church in Brunswick and was made Christ Church Frederica's rector. As a memorial to Ellen, Anson Dodge began rebuilding Christ Church in the shape of the cross. The new church was completed that same year. Ellen's casket was placed in a lead-lined vault beneath the altar with instructions that it be removed and interred in Dodge's grave upon his death. Dodge devoted his life to building schools and churches for black and white congregations. He built 3 churches for black residents of St. Simon's. One of them, St. Ignatius, continues to hold regular services. Like Christ Church Frederica, St. Ignatius was constructed in the form of a cross. In 1890, the Reverend Dodge married Anna Deborah Gould, the granddaughter of James Gould, who built St. Simon's first lighthouse. At the age of 3, their son, Anson Phelps Dodge III, was killed in a runaway carriage accident. His grave is marked with a simple cross. The Anson Dodge Boys' Home for Orphan Boys was established at Frederica in memory of their infant son. Anna Gould Dodge spent the rest of her life raising and nurturing orphan boys until her death in 1927. The Dodge burial plot is located just a few yards from the west end of Christ Church. Anna Gould Dodge is buried on the far left of the plot, next to her son's grave. In accordance with Anson Dodge's instructions, the remains of his first wife, Ellen, were removed from the vault beneath the altar. Both his body and hers were buried side by side in plain pine coffins. Dodge died at the age of 39. His funeral was the largest ever held on the island, with 7 ministers, including one who was African American, officiating. Most of the island's black population, some 2,000 people, came to pay their respects. Like Oglethorpe before him, Anson Dodge embodied the spirit of colonial Georgia's motto, "Not for self, but for others." The church Anson Dodge rebuilt continues to hold regular services and receives thousands of tourists each year. After the Civil War, Charles Stevens' wife Sarah returned to Frederica, which remained under her stewardship and the care of her descendants for many years. For a while, she served as postmistress for the island. Stevens' daughter Mary was born at Frederica and, with the exception of the Civil War years, lived there her entire life. Mary's sister Isabella, known as Belle, was also born at Frederica. She married William Curtis Taylor in 1875 and had 9 children, all of whom lived on the island. In 1903, Belle Stevens Taylor donated the old fort and 60 feet of land around it to the Georgia Society of Colonial Dames of America. In the 1940s, the rest of Frederica was deeded to the National Park Service, and the remaining Taylor family members relocated to other areas on the island. This photograph from the late 1920s shows Mary Stevens on the left, Isabella in the middle, and John Lawrence Stevens on the right. As a boy, John had remained at Frederica with James Frewen during the Civil War. When Frewen died, it was John who went to the south end of the island to inform the Union officer who sent a burial detail. John Stevens captained this boat named Annie, transporting passengers and supplies up and down the Georgia coast, including trips to the mills at Gascoigne Bluff. 5 of Isabella Stephen Taylor's sons are shown here. Their uncle, Isabella's brother John, is third from the right. The Taylors were among the last of a breed of island men who lived off the land and waters surrounding St. Simon's. They owned and operated the popular Taylor's Fish Camp on the eastern side of the island at Lawrence Plantation. The Taylors owned this inboard gasoline engine launch named Teal, which they used for guided fishing tours during the 1920s and 1930s. The Stevens and Taylor homes occupied a large footprint of Frederica, from the fort to the present-day Welcome Center. This map depicts the approximate locations of the Stevens and Taylor homes, as well as the Dodge Home for Orphan Boys, as they appeared in the 1940s before the land was acquired by the National Park Service. This photograph shows a barn that was raised near the fort ruins. One home, shown on the right in this picture, was also located very near the fort ruins. In addition to the Stevens and Taylor homes, there was a school at Frederica, which island children attended. Frederica remained a vibrant part of island life, a place where locals gathered for picnics, 4th of July celebrations, and other special occasions. On the site where Oglethorpe's men once kept vigil for Spanish attack, and where James Frewen sent signals to Charles Stevens on the mainland during the Civil War, visitors enjoyed their leisure time. They still do. After the Civil War, the former slaves, now freed men and women on St. Simon's, who once worked on the plantations, congregated into 3 main settlements. Former Cooper, Gould, and other plantation hands settled in Harrington, defined mostly by North and South Harrington streets. Hamilton and Retreat freedmen clustered in the Jewtown community on Demery Road between Frederica Road and Gascoigne Bluff. The south end was settled primarily by former Retreat and Kelvin Grove slaves. Each community was, and still is, anchored by a local church built by the congregants. Before the Civil War, some slaves attended services at Christ Church Episcopal, while others created makeshift brush arbor outdoor churches. In Harrington, the first African Baptist church was organized before the Civil War and built in 1869. In the Jewtown community, St. Ignatius Episcopal and St. Paul Baptist still provide places of worship. And those living in the South End settlement built Emmanuel Baptist Church. In South Carolina, the term Gullah refers to blacks who inherited the African traditions, beliefs, superstitions, and language handed down by their ancestors. On Georgia's barrier islands, these people are referred to as Gullah Geechee, or simply Geechee, possibly named for the Ogeechee River. The freed blacks were resourceful, hard-working, and independent, making most of the utensils and equipment they required by hand. With ingenuity, they made do with what was available to them. Men like Charles Wilson kept alive traditions such as basket weaving, a skill brought over by his African ancestors and handed down by each succeeding generation. Most of the food they ate came from what they raised on the land or acquired by hunting and fishing. After the Civil War, the island's white population had largely abandoned St. Simon's. For entertainment, the black children created their own games and, for the most part, had the run of the island. Some of the islanders inherited African superstitions passed down from slavery. To ensure a dead person's spirit would not return to its home, personal possessions of the deceased would be placed on the grave. Objects were broken not only to symbolize a life as ended, but to prevent evil spirits from walking on the grave and disturbing the dead. Floyd White grew up in a Retreat Plantation slave cabin. His mother belonged to the Kings of Retreat Plantation, but his father was a postel slave at Kelvin Grove. As an adult, it is said that he kept a corn still at this house. He was killed by a drunk driver while walking on Demray Road near the Bloody Marsh Monument. The cabin, located at the intersection of Demray and Frederica Roads, may have once been a part of Mulberry Plantation. For years, the former slave cabin has served as a gift shop. The interior has been preserved for the most part, and visitors can see the inside pretty much the way it was in the antebellum era. Willis Proctor, who lived in the South End community on St. Simon's, was an entrepreneur and was well respected by islanders. His grandfather helped plant the avenue of live oaks leading to the Retreat Plantation in 1848. His mother was a retreat slave, and his father belonged to the Gould family. Slaves who married someone from another plantation was said to have married abroad. Mr. Proctor worked at the Jekyll Island Club and became William Rockefeller's personal valet. He also owned and operated a business in the South End community for many years. Until the late 1900s, this section of Mallory Street, running from Demray Road to the curve west of Demray, was named Proctor Lane. Very few slave descendants could trace their ancestors to a specific location. Ben Sullivan is one. His Arabic features hint at his Muslim ancestry. He is shown here in 1938 at the age of 88. Ben's grandfather, Salibu Ali, was a Fula tribe member from the town of Kiana in present-day Mali. At the age of 14, he was captured by African slave raiders, sold to European slave traders, and later purchased in the Bahamas by John Cooper of Cannon's Point. Salibu Ali kept a Koran and practiced the Muslim faith throughout his life. James Hamilton Cooper made him head man of Hoopton Plantation, where he oversaw 450 slaves. In the Harrington section, a one-room schoolhouse with exceptional teachers gave young black students educational opportunities. This Rosenwald School, named for Sears executive Julius Rosenwald, opened in the 1920s. It also served as a community center for many years. Local residents of both races have combined efforts to restore the school and preserve its historical significance to the island. One famous island resident was Robert Abbott, the son of slaves, who became a millionaire and a chief instigator of the migration of Southern blacks to northern cities. Robert's father, Thomas, belonged to Captain Charles Stevens of Frederica. Thomas held a privileged position in the Stevens household. He was allowed to attend church and learn to read and write. The other male servants whom he had charge over considered Thomas something of a tyrant. Robert Abbott left the island as an infant after his father died and was raised in Savannah. Eventually, he moved to Chicago and at the age of 38 began the Chicago Defender with working capital of 25 cents. This newspaper, tailored to black audiences, had a circulation of 200,000 in the 1920s and made Robert Abbott a wealthy man. Abbott was a chief advocate of the Great Migration, urging Southern blacks to leave the Jim Crow South and move north, where the auto industry and other opportunities awaited. Between 1915 and 1925, over 1 million blacks heard Abbott's call and made the trek up north, bringing their culture and their music with them. But Abbott never forgot his family's relationship with the Stevens family of Frederica. He requested their permission to erect a monument on his father's grave, which was on Stevens' land, to honor his father and to aunts. During the Great Depression, he provided financial assistance to some Stevens family members for upkeep of the monument property. He even helped pay for their children's education. Neptune Small, who looked after his young masters during the Civil War, lived to a ripe old age. He adopted the surname Small in light of his small physical stature. Tradition holds that for his service to the King family, he was given a small plot where he lived for many years. It is said that Neptune Park was named in his honor, and that his home was once nestled among these oaks. This old photograph of Neptune's home shows that electricity had been strung to it. Old courthouse records indicate this house may have actually been in the Park Avenue neighborhood just north of the village, across from the baseball fields. In the 1920s, Lydia Parrish, wife of artist Maxfield Parrish, began cataloging songs sung by local African Americans who eventually became known as the Sea Island Singers. The singers gained wide renown for their renditions of spiritual, harvest, and work tunes. In the 1950s, famed folklorist Alan Lomax recorded their songs. These songs, handed down from slavery, have been passed along to new generations of singers who keep the tradition alive. The Sea Island Singers have entertained presidents and world leaders visiting the area. Before the advent of radio and phonographs, islanders made their own music, a tradition going back to colonial days and no doubt to Indian occupation. Bill Tatnall, shown here on his front porch near Frederica, was recorded by Alan Lomax in the 1930s. In February of 1938, the Christchurch Episcopal pastor, Charles Lee, who lived in this former rectory near the East Beach Causeway, was murdered. This was during Prohibition, when authority figures, including Reverend Lee, railed against vices like alcohol consumption. Lee was shot through the back window while at his study writing a sermon. Some people speculated he had been killed because of his vocal opposition to liquor and gambling establishments on the island. George Claiborne, an African-American living in the nearby South End community, went to prison. Several white men implicated in the crime were acquitted. The murder remains a mystery. The Washboard Band, a group of local musicians, made a name for themselves playing in local clubs and at events on Sea Island and Jekyll. In 1958, they recorded an album under the RCA Victor label. One former resident from the South End community became an internationally known figure. James Nathaniel Brown left the island at an early age and made a name for himself as an NFL Hall of Fame running back, a Hollywood actor, and a key figure supporting African-American-owned businesses. In 1988, he started a program to mentor inter-city gang members. After the Civil War, Mallory King of Retreat Plantation tried his hand at various endeavors to generate income. Mallory had worked at the Dodge Miggs lumber mill on Gascoigne Bluff and noticed that the sawmills attracted many people over the years who found St. Simon's to be an idyllic place to visit. One idea he had was to turn Retreat into a resort with island tours and beach outings, but that scheme didn't last. In the late 1890s, Mallory subdivided property between his Retreat Plantation home and the lighthouse into 140 lots that sold for $100 each, about $2,000 per lot in today's dollars. The island's first subdivision was appropriately named King City. The streets of King City were named after family members. Lots for businesses and even a hotel were set out along Mallory Street. A pier built on the south end of the island gave tourists easy access to the village area. They came by train to Brunswick and then by boat to St. Simon's. Before long, seaside hotels, restaurants, and bathing houses populated the village area. In this photograph, the Pier Hotel advertises a restaurant, drinks, and bathing suits. As you can see in this photograph, bathing suits of the day covered much of the body. This two-story casino by the pier gave the community space for indoor recreation. A spacious dance floor surrounded by a wide veranda occupied the second story. A bowling alley was on the first floor, where visitors could also purchase sandwiches and cold drinks. After the lumber mills on Gascoigne Bluff closed, the post office was moved to the village. Mail deliveries were made by horse and buggy. Shops like this dry goods and clothing store opened up on Mallory Street to serve residents and tourists alike. There is evidence that a summer resort for African Americans was also established in the vicinity of the South End neighborhood. This facility might have catered to servants who accompanied white families staying at the island's other hotels. Vacationers made the most of their time, enjoying the sun and water, like riding this giant water slide built next to the pier. In 1888, the three-story Hotel St. Simons was constructed on what is now Massingale Park property, formerly part of the Postel plantation. The hotel featured a wide covered veranda and a large dining room. Behind the hotel, a 60-foot-high tank supplied fresh water from a deep well. Along with 20 rental cottages located on the same grounds, the hotel could accommodate 300 people. Visitors could comfortably stroll down a boardwalk to catch ocean breezes or to watch others enjoying the surf. Hotel guests were transported from the pier by a mule-drawn trolley and were often greeted at the hotel by a small orchestra performing for guests. The summer season usually ran from May 1st to October 15th. Since the same company owned both hotels, furniture, linen, and dining ware for the Hotel St. Simons were transferred from the Oglethorpe Hotel on Newcastle Street in Brunswick. After the summer season ended, everything was returned to the Oglethorpe Hotel. Some guests camped out on the north end of St. Simons and on Long Island, now called Sea Island, where hunting preserves were stocked with pheasant, turkey, and wild deer. A few automobiles were brought over to the island on ferries, providing more modern transportation for hunting and fishing expeditions. A group of summer homes sprang up next to the lighthouse. Many of these beach cottages were owned by Waycross residents and became known as the Waycross Colony. Here, visitors enjoyed ocean breezes while sitting in the shade of a front porch. In summers, menfolk worked on the mainland during the week, took the train to Brunswick, and rode the ferry to St. Simons to be with their families on the weekend. The younger generation experienced their own version of endless summers, splashing in the surf, fishing off the pier, bowling at the casino, or just relaxing on a hammock in the shade, waiting for the dinner bell. In 1898, the Spanish-American War began, and St. Simons was once more host to an invading army, this time American soldiers who came by boat and by barge. Though never used in military action, gun batteries were set up overlooking the St. Simons Sound between the village and Retreat Plantation to protect the port of Brunswick. The locals did their part to make the visiting army feel at home, as these members of a North Carolina regiment discovered. Camp Barker occupied much of Neptune Park near the village. Here you can see part of the Waycross Colony in the foreground. Today, this space is occupied by the St. Simons Library, casino theater, a public pool, and a miniature golf course. In December 1898, the Hotel St. Simons burned down. Vacationers found accommodations at other island hotels, like the Ocean View Hotel, located near the current King and Prince. Room rates were $2 a night, about $56 in modern currency, or $11 for a week, which is about $300 today. A new St. Simon's Hotel under different management was erected on the site of the old one in 1910. This three-story hotel with a wide wraparound porch afforded year-round accommodations to visitors. In the evenings, dining room guests wore formal attire. The new hotel offered rental cottages with maid service. Like its predecessor, a long boardwalk led down to the ocean. A narrow-gauge track connected to the pier made it more convenient for hotel guests arriving by boat to reach the St. Simon's Hotel in comfort. By 1910, the old mule-drawn trolley had been replaced by motorized conveyances capable of carrying 30 people at a time. Like its predecessor, the new St. Simon's Hotel burned down in 1916. That same year, the Hotel Bellevue near the pier was rechristened the St. Simon's Hotel. Today, Massingale, the site of the old and new St. Simon's Hotels, is a popular county park that provides tourists and locals alike access to the beach. By the early 1920s, the days of the horse and buggy on St. Simon's were about to be numbered. And the pier, once the hub of activity for people coming onto or leaving the island, would soon be relegated to a popular fishing spot. For at that time, a causeway was being built across the 4-mile length of marsh and tidal rivers separating St. Simon's from the mainland. The man in charge of constructing the causeway was a Georgia Tech engineer and Brunswick city manager named Fernando Torres. Torres had experience building bridges and roads in South America and was chosen to find a route across the marsh. The Brunswick-St. Simon's Highway, as it was then called, was completed in 13 months, costing a little over $5 million in today's dollars. A manually operated swing bridge could be opened for Frederica River traffic and closed to allow cars to cross over to the island. The Frederica and Back River bridges would later be replaced with vertical lift spans and more recently by tall bridges that require no mechanical operation. The causeway officially opened in 1924. Following a parade, city and state dignitaries as well as local residents attended the opening ceremony. Later, thousands of visitors drove across the new causeway and feasted under the oaks on Gascoigne Bluff. In 1952, the year after Torres died, 29 years after its dedication, the road would be renamed the F.J. Torres Causeway. The causeway's impact on St. Simon's was immediate and still resonates today. Overnight, automobiles became a common sight in the village and elsewhere on the island. With the new causeway in place and the drive from the mainland reduced to a matter of minutes, excursions to Gascoigne Bluff, the village, and the ruins of Fort Frederica were common. Even before the new causeway was completed, Brunswick residents who had summer cottages on St. Simon's began to think about building permanent homes on the island. This 1924 plan for a new subdivision included parks on the north and south ends of East Beach, a hotel with parks in the middle at about 10th Street, and 2 causeways connecting it to Demray Road. In 1935, the Works Progress Administration, under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, began construction on a Coast Guard station at the foot of East Beach, just yards from the high tide watermark. By the 1950s, the land between the station and the ocean had accreted substantially. This facility is now a maritime museum with exhibits that inform visitors about its history. Today, the buildup of land in front of the former Coast Guard station extends over 100 yards, as has the terrain fronting the original beach houses built on East Beach. The shore fronting this neighborhood is continually changing due to action of wind, ocean currents, and wave action. The main part of St. Simon's was formed over 25,000 years ago during the Pleistocene geological period. East Beach and Sea Island were formed about 10,000 years later during the Holocene epoch. In the 1920s, Brunswick businessmen purchased Long Island, once owned by John Cooper of Cannons Point, and built a dirt causeway connecting it with St. Simons. Though they sold lots, no homes were constructed, and this venture soon folded. Soon after that, Hudson Motor Company executive Howard Coffin purchased Long Island. He would rename it Glen Isle and later Sea Island. Coffin and his cousin Alfred Jones developed Sea Island into a modern resort destination with generations of loyal followers who returned with their families year after year. On St. Simons, Coffin bought Retreat Plantation, where he built a world-class golf course, converting the old Tabby barn into a clubhouse. Bobby Jones played on the Retreat course, declaring Seaside the best 9 holes I have ever played. Coffin improved the infrastructure on St. Simons as well. Due to his efforts, Kingsway and other new roads were built, electricity and a telephone exchange came to the island, and a larger airport, named for former Brunswick Mayor Malcolm McKinnon, was constructed on what was once Mulberry Grove and Retreat Plantation cotton fields. In the 1920s, small towns and cities across America vied to put their names on the map in order to attract tourists and industry. Brunswick and Sea Island were no exceptions. Charles Lindbergh had just completed his solo flight to Paris in the spirit of St. Louis, and Brunswick businessmen offered a $25,000 prize to whoever flew solo from Brunswick to Rio de Janeiro. 25-year-old Paul Redfern, an aviator from Columbia, South Carolina, seen here on the right, rose to the challenge. Redford's single-motor plane, the Port of Brunswick, was scheduled to make the 4,600-mile trip in 52 hours, a much longer flight than Lindbergh's. The night before the flight, a party was held in Redfern's honor at the casino by the pier. On August 25, 1927, Redfern lifted off of the Sea Island beach. Due to the weight of the fuel his plane carried, it took him 2 attempts to get airborne. Redfern was last seen flying over Venezuela. He never made it across the Amazon jungle to Rio, and his plane has never been located. The island's original airport, which Redfern often used, was renamed Redfern Airfield in his honor. Today, it is known as Redfern Village, home to popular restaurants and retail shops. In 1929, an antique dealer in Massachusetts purchased an old clock. Inside, he found a card inscribed USS Ethan Allen on blockade, January 10, 1863. The dealer traced the clock back to Retreat Plantation, where it had been stolen during the Civil War. With Howard Coffin, not shown here, serving as host, the clock was returned to Retreat in a formal ceremony with dignitaries from Georgia and Massachusetts in attendance. In 1937, Howard Coffin, in ill health and distraught over the death of his wife Matilda, took his own life. Both he and his wife are buried at Christ Church. In life, it was their habit to sleep with their beds positioned in a north-south orientation. In death, their graves lie in the same due north-south alignment. The legacy of men like Mallory King and Howard Coffin lives on as St. Simons and Sea Island continue to be popular tourist destinations to this day. World War II brought another enemy force to the waters surrounding St. Simons. In the spring of 1942, German U-boats patrolled the Georgia coast looking for military and merchant marine targets. On the night of April 8, 1942, in 35 feet of water off the St. Simons coast, a U-boat torpedoed 2 oil tankers, the SS Oklahoma and the SO Baton Rouge. 22 merchant marines lost their lives that night. Survivors were rescued by the Coast Guard and by a local boat captain, Olaf Olsen, who was the first person to reach the wrecks. Both ships were raised and brought to Brunswick for repairs. As this photograph shows, the German torpedo that sunk this ship created a hole large enough to drive a locomotive through. In response to the war effort, the United States government erected a shipyard on the south end of Brunswick near the present-day Sydney Lanier Bridge. The shipyard produced 99 cargo vessels, nicknamed Liberty ships, which were used to carry grain and military supplies to Europe and later to the Pacific. The Navy installed a blimp base on the north end of Brunswick, where the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center is now located. Dirigibles like this Navy blimp were used to hunt German U-boats along the coast from Mayport, Florida to Savannah, Georgia. While on patrol, crews on these blimps often used carrier pigeons to send messages back to base instead of using radio transmission. During the war, 90,000 vessels were escorted by blimps like these, with no loss to enemy action. On St. Simons, the United States Navy leased McKinnon Airport and converted it into a fighter training base. The Navy built a new control tower, runways, and barracks. For recreation, the Navy built a gymnasium with a stage in the building, highlighted in this photo. After the war, it was known as the Playhouse, a place where young islanders played basketball and where stage productions took place. A baseball field just visible in this picture was laid out on the north end of the main runway. On the lower right of this picture, you can see the former slave quarters where Floyd White once lived. Movement on and off the island base was strictly monitored. The threat of spies and saboteurs infiltrating the coast by way of German U-boats ensured heightened security efforts. Pilots were trained to fly aircraft like the Hellcat fighter plane and the Avenger torpedo dive bomber. Unfortunately, a number of plane wrecks occurred during training, some of which resulted in the loss of lives. The island residents did their part to aid the war effort. Many volunteered for beach patrol duties, while those with flying skills joined the civilian air patrol, searching for enemy U-boats. Others served as enemy plane spotters on towers like this. One tower was erected on the causeway and another in the Glen Haven neighborhood. Just as they did during the Spanish-American War, the locals turned out to entertain the men stationed on the island. Many of those men and their families returned to vacation on the island after the war and still visit the area. Later in the war, the St. Simons Naval Air Station's mission changed from fighter training to supporting a new combat information center. The King and Prince Hotel was converted into a naval radar training school. Over $7 million worth of electric equipment was set up on the island to support the operation. Navy personnel received months of concentrated instruction in radar, aircraft operations, electronics, navigation, and anti-submarine warfare. The influx of shipyard workers and Navy personnel overwhelmed the available housing in the Brunswick area, and the population nearly doubled overnight. Many residents took in boarders. Some workers, operating in different shifts, even used the same bed. Tents were set up for the overflow of military personnel coming to the island. Soon, homes were constructed to provide more permanent housing. The new homes formed new neighborhoods, like King's Terrace near the airport and Oglethorpe Park off Frederica Road on former postal land. These houses are homes to island residents to this day. Hurricanes have always been a threat to people living on the coast. In 1964, Hurricane Dora made landfall above St. Augustine, Florida. Further north, its powerful sustained winds slammed into the Georgia coast. On St. Simons, a row of oceanfront homes near the elementary school were destroyed, leaving behind rubble in the hurricane's destructive wake. As shown in this picture, Hurricane Dora and the hurricane of 1898 took large bites out of the island's southeast corner, from 7th Street to Myrtle Street. In response to the damage caused by storm-driven waves, President Lyndon Baines Johnson appropriated funds to build a rock seawall from the south end of the island to the King and Prince Hotel at Arnold Road, and from 11th Street on East Beach to the north end at Gould's Inlet. Eugenia Price, whose books about St. Simons have captivated the imaginations of readers from around the world, first came to the island in 1961. While on a book tour through the South, she chanced upon a passage in a travel guide about St. Simons and the tragic loss of Anson Dodge's first wife, Ellen. Intrigued by the story, Eugenia visited the island and fell in love with its enchanting beauty. She also learned about James Gould, who built the island's first lighthouse, and she heard many other stories of St. Simon's past, told to her by the local islanders. These stories and Price's subsequent research resulted in her widely read trilogy Beloved Invader, New Moon Rising, and Lighthouse. Her books have sold in the millions and have done much to generate interest in the island. Upon her death in 1996, Eugenia Price was buried behind Christ Church, not far from the graves of Anson Dodge and James Gould. The causeway connecting the island to the mainland has somewhat changed since it opened in 1924. It is now a 4-lane highway capable of handling thousands of vehicles each day. Just like in its early days, the village offers tourists and residents places to dine, purchase gifts, or just window shop. And it remains a popular place to hang out during the day or night. In some respects, the village hasn't changed a whole lot over the years. The store names might change, but the stores remain. Buildings like the one that once housed this grocery store are continually being reused in different ways, catering to the needs of new generations of shoppers. History lives on in the street and place names, too. Lord Avenue is named for Lordy King, who died on the battlefield at Fredericksburg, Virginia. Neptune Park by the county casino is named for Neptune Small, the slave who rescued Lordy King's body from the Fredericksburg battlefield and brought it back to Georgia. Mallory King, whose vision led to the creation of the village and the tourism industry on St. Simons, is remembered by the main street that runs from the pier to Demery Road. The original 1810 lighthouse, built by James Gould, was demolished by Confederate soldiers during the Civil War. It was replaced by a 104-foot-tall structure in 1872. Located next to the Coastal Georgia Historical Society, today's lighthouse is accessible to anyone willing to climb the 129 steps of its cast-iron spiral stairway leading to the top. Just as its people enjoyed strolling and fishing on the island's pier in the 1800s and 1900s, visitors to the island today can do the same on this modern concrete pier. Looking back toward the shore from the end of the pier, you might be able to envision the old St. Simon's Hotel and other buildings from that era that used to be on that spot. And while the old trolley no longer runs from the pier to the Hotel St. Simon's, you can sit back and soak in the history of the island while enjoying a comfortable ride in one of the local trolley tours. The old tourist hotels may be gone, but they have been replaced by newer hotels that provide guests with modern amenities and, best of all, access to the beach. The same sand and surf that attracted Georgians to the island in the last century continued to lure tourists from around the world. You can still see the evidence of those who have come before, from the tabby structures of colonial and antebellum days to the late 1800s and to the early 1900s. And if you look closely enough, you might even spot the occasional British flag, another reminder of the island's many-layered past. Today, freighters from around the world enter the Sound between St. Simon's and Jekyll Island, transporting goods to and from Brunswick. These modern ships navigate the same channel as the invading Spanish fleet in 1742, and sailing ships exporting timber from the mills on Gascoigne Bluff in the late 1800s. Where German U-boats once prowled, local shrimp boats ply their trade, and charter fishing boats cater to tourists. Driving on to St. Simon's Island is like traveling back in time, where layers of history reveal themselves little by little. The island, once a wilderness to settlers, has been tamed by 200 years of occupation. On this same ground where people enjoy golf, tennis, and fine food, native Indians once lived and hunted. Spanish monks established their missions. English and Scottish Highlanders defended their territory, and slaves worked its cotton fields. Some days in the early light, you can see the same sights as the first native who stood on St. Simon's sandy shore. You might wonder who else once stood on that spot, marveling at its tranquil beauty, and who, many years from now, will do the same thing. And in that moment, you too have become a part of the island's history.